So that purple part in the middle is Yehud, or Judah. I don't know how much this is entirely accurate or how much this is a guess. But the main thing I see as I look at this is that the land of Judah is a lot smaller than it was back when King David and Solomon ruled, or even when it's like Hezekiah. And now you've got all these little provinces around Judah that are part of a bigger district of the Persian Empire. So the Persians subdivided everything into areas. I think they called them satrapies. And then each of those was subdivided into smaller areas. I think something like you'd think of, we have the United States, we've got states, then we've got local county governments. And if you think of it that way, Judah is just one little county in the huge Persian Empire. So on this map, Judah's in purple. North of Judah in green is Samaria. And that's where especially I'd like to talk through what's the history of the Samaritans, the people living there. To the east of the Jordan River in the orange area is what would have been the country of Ammon before the Persian Empire. Now there's also a name on it called the Tobiads. There's a family that is ruling in that area. So there are going to be people with the name of Tobiad in Ezra and Nehemiah. So if you hear that name, think of the people off to the east. Moab is down south of that in the green. Nabatea is a name associated with that area as we head into the New Testament time. South of Judah is Idumea. That gets its name from Edom. Idumea and Edom are connected. And the Edomites in the Old Testament before this had always been less powerful. David conquered them. But the Idumeans are going to stick around, and actually Herod the Great was an Idumean, which always kind of irked the Israelites, the Judeans, because you had an Idumean, Herod, and his family were the ones who were ruling over Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So Idumea is south, Ashdod and Dor are along the coast. So a lot of the setting now in Ezra and Nehemiah is there's a lot of pressure from these other groups of people around them who don't want to see the Jews in Judea prospering, because if Jerusalem's strong, that makes them a little bit weaker. So that's going to play in here in Ezra chapter 4. If I pause there, anything you want to ask about that map, or just kind of what the political situation is like at the time of Ezra? For me, it's helpful if you know of maps from different time periods, because the way it looks at the time of David is different than the way it looked at the time of the return from exile. Again, it's going to look different at the time of Jesus. And if you can know how the borders are shifting and how things are changing, that helps understanding the stories a little better. So if you're going to talk about the Samaritans, it's a little more complex than just here's the simple answer for where they came from. The Bible itself has 3 different passages that talk about when people came and resettled this area. So the basic background of the Samaritans is that the Assyrians, when they conquered the northern kingdom in the 700s BC, deported some, probably not all of the people, away. And then they later on resettled people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire back into that area. The Assyrians had this philosophy: you terrorize the people you conquer, and there always was this threat that if you don't fall into line and serve us and give us tribute, we are going to deport you and take you away from home. And so there are other peoples then where their punishment was, because you were conquered by the Assyrians, you're going to have to go and live over in the land of Israel. So 1 Kings chapter 17 has the longest section that describes this. That it doesn't name the king, but that probably would have been during the reign of Sargon II, was the Assyrian king who reigned from 721 to 705. The date I've learned in my head for when the kingdom fell was in 722. So this would have been right after Samaria fell and the Israelites were deported. Sargon II then brought in a bunch of people to repopulate the land from elsewhere. Ezra chapter 4 is going to have two different references to two different Assyrian kings. One says that Esarhaddon brought people back. That would have been in the 680s to 660s. Ashurbanipal is a name I remember from high school world history. He ruled for like 30-some years, was hugely influential in the whole world at that time. Ezra chapter 4 says Ashurbanipal resettled some people back over in the land of Israel as well. So the background of the Samaritans then is you've got people who are from the 12 tribes mixed in with these foreigners who have been resettled there with them, and that impacted their religion then too. So let me pull up these passages. If you've got a Bible, 1 Kings chapter 17 is a good place to start. 1 Kings 17, starting at verse 24. Did I have 1 Kings? Should be 2 Kings. 2 Kings 17. It says this, the king of Assyria, again, it doesn't name the king. Sargon II would have been the king right after Samaria fell. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord. So he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, the people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off, because the people do not know what he requires. Then the king of Assyria gave this order. Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires. So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled and set them up in the shrines, set up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. The people from Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, those from Kuhath made Nergal, those from Hamath made Ashima, the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burned their children in their fire as sacrifices to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. To this day they persist in their former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve or sacrifice to them. But the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt with mighty power and outstretched arm, is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. They would not listen, however, but persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their ancestors did. The point today is not to go through that in a lot of detail, but what would you pick out as some of the main points that 2 Kings makes about the background to the Samaritans?
They killed their own children?
They were part of, at least some of them, child sacrifice was part of their worship. That had been part of the Canaanites. Molech is the name of the god that is associated with that in the Old Testament. We know that the Phoenician people sacrificed their kids to Baal. So this is another version of that being brought over from the Babylon area and settled in. At the same time, who are they also offering sacrifices to? Other gods, yep, but even
the true God.
capital Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Israelites. And how about that for just a total disconnect, huh? Can you sacrifice your kids in the fire to a Babylonian god and then go and sacrifice to the Lord? 2 Kings would say, you can't do that. But that was, at least for a time, what was happening in this area of Samaria. Now, this makes it sound like it's only people from over there. From what I've read, people would say that it probably wasn't that all the Israelites got deported. There would have still been some people who were from the 12 tribes living there. It would have been a mix of people. But you've got them bringing in their gods from the Babylonian era. And as they settle in, then they're worshiping both. The comment at the end here, how long did that situation continue? Which is when? When 2 Kings was written. That doesn't mean that it persisted that way forever and ever, but as this is being written and compiled, they say this is continued up till now. We know 2 Kings was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, so that'd be like in the 580s. From what I know, Kings was probably compiled shortly after the fall of Jerusalem or sometime during the exile. It doesn't mention the return. Chronicles covers the same time period, but is written later after the return. And so it's covering the same content, but with a little different angle because it's written to people who are now back in the land. So this comment that it's still going on now is probably talking that it lasted until about the mid-500s. So if that slide I had, it's probably 100 or 150 years that comment would be true, that there's this mixture. The fancy word for that's called syncretism, that you try to blend together different religions and say we can just mix it together and worship multiple gods. Did you see, too, the sense that each area has its own god is the ancient pagan way of looking at it? So God allows lions to come and start eating people, and then the reaction is, oh, I guess we don't know how to worship the local god. So we're going to keep on worshiping these foreign gods we brought in, but we'd better also add in the worship of the local god so that we don't get eaten by lions, was at least part of the religious rationale behind what they were doing. So you've got the Lord God being worshipped. You also have other gods being worshipped right alongside that too, even to the point of sacrificing their kids. If you'd read the other historical books, you'd see that like Hezekiah invited people from this area to come down for the Passover in Jerusalem. So there was a sense that there were people in this northern area who were worshiping the true God and were welcome to come to Jerusalem and worship at the temple. Whether that would have been everyone or would they had a way of saying that if you just sacrificed your kids, that's not the same faith and you're not going to come worship with us. But even after the northern kingdom fell, there was a sense that in Jerusalem, the king there and the temple had an influence over the whole area, even this area where the Samaritans lived. Anything you want to ask further there, or just comments before we keep moving?
I have a question. Were there ever wars going on in this place time rather that...
Like back and forth between those two?
Well, was the war any war based on religion?
Yeah, there would have been, and that'll come up as far as why in Jesus' day is there such animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. Part of it is because there had been wars fought between the two of them in the past. For the most part, when you've got a big empire ruling, they don't want to have people fighting each other within the empire. So like when they're part of the Persian Empire, that has a way of kind of keeping a damper on outright just we're going to go to war with each other. Although when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, it does sound that the Samaritans came in and maybe burned down part of the walls just before Nehemiah came back. So there would have been just all out using force against each other sometimes. So again, that's looking back at an earlier time. Ezra says there were people who came back at the time of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, so that would have been another 50 or 100 years after that. This would be my summary of, so this commentary had a few-page summary of the whole history. And it would say you should look at the Samaritans in 3 different time periods. That initial period from about 700 till maybe, 300, when it exactly shifted, we don't know. But for a while they were polytheistic, where they're worshiping the Lord and they're worshiping whatever other god or gods they want to worship too. That's what 2 Kings really focuses on, is that they couldn't say they were purely worshiping the Lord. That wasn't right. Now sometime, and again, when did they shift? The next period, they stop. By the time you get to the New Testament, they're not worshiping other gods. The Samaritans are monotheistic, and they're worshiping only the Lord. So when exactly that shift took place, I don't know that well enough to be able to put a date on it, and it could be that's fuzzy for everybody. But sometime, as it's shifting like that, the Samaritans built a temple that was a copy of the Jerusalem temple on top of Mount Gerizim, which is one of the hilltops in central Samaria. Whether that was something that pushed them to only worship the Lord, when they built that temple, were they still worshiping other gods too? Or had they already switched to saying, we're only going to worship the Lord? Josephus is a historian who writes just after the time of Jesus. He says that there was like someone who married into a priest's family, and that was the impetus to say the Samaritans are only going to worship the Lord. Or like the coming of Alexander the Great was something that pushed that change. And the commentary I read, that I don't know for sure why they made that switch. But they shifted toward being monotheistic and saying we're only going to worship the Lord. And they built a temple on top of Mount Gerizim, which is going to fit in with Ezra because the Israelites at the time of the return are going to say, we're not going to let you help us rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. Then you're in this next phase, and when exactly that starts, that's kind of fuzzy. But this next phase, they're not sacrificing their kids, they're not worshiping other gods, they're only worshiping the Lord. They're not part of worship in Jerusalem. They have their own temple on Mount Gerizim where they're offering sacrifices. They also have their own version of the Bible. I have that on the list as the Samaritan Pentateuch. They accepted only the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they altered some of the passages to say that the place to worship God has to be on Mount Gerizim. So if you'd read the Samaritan Old Testament, they have 10 commandments. Only 9 of them line up with what we have. Their 10th commandment is you must worship God on Mount Gerizim. And so if you look back, they would claim that they have the original Old Testament, but it is very much more likely that they took what the Jews were using and then edited it. Most of it is exactly the same, but they changed it to say that Mount Gerizim is the place you have to worship God. You'd say, if you'd ask why did they reject the rest of the Old Testament, maybe it's some of the same reasons like the Sadducees didn't use the rest of the Old Testament either. But one thing the rest of the Old Testament makes clear is that the temple was to be in Jerusalem. And so it would have been very hard for them to use the rest of the Old Testament without giving up this core belief they had that God was to be worshipped on top of Mount Gerizim. Other thing you should know from that time period, and here's where Ken asked, are they ever actually fighting each other? In the year 110, this is when the Jews regained their own freedom. We talked about that a few weeks ago. That for a while the Jews rebelled against the Greek bigger empires in the area and were able to govern themselves. During that time period, there was a man named John Hyrcanus who took an army up and burned down the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, which didn't help with Jew and Samaritan relations. So if you are wondering why are the Jews and Samaritans always against each other in the New Testament, it's because there's all this back history that by the time of Jesus has been going on for 700 years. So initially, the main problem was you've got people coming from, resettled from areas around Babylon where they're not worshiping the Lord at all. When they do worship the Lord, they're only taking him in as one of many gods that they worship. And so when we read in Ezra that the Jews say, you can't help us rebuild the temple, that's very much in the background for why they would say that. Then they do shift to being monotheistic, but now there's this huge debate about where you worship God. And the Jews actually had gone up and burned down the temple that the Samaritans were worshiping at. Still today, and here's where the commentary I read said you should think of this as kind of a third time, is there still are people today who would identify as Samaritans, somewhere around 800 people, where they have kept going these traditions that the Samaritans handed down. So is that, I guess before I go there, here's a passage from the time of Jesus, John chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. The setting is Jesus is in Samaria talking to a woman at a well. And of all things in the whole world, what does she ask Jesus? She says, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." And I think if you don't know the backstory, you say, what in the world is she doing? Like, this, where'd this come from? This seems so random to us. Like, if you really were sitting down with someone who might be the Messiah, would you ask him that? The answer is, for a Samaritan, yeah, you would, because that is the huge distinction between Jews and Samaritans, comes down to where you worship God. And when she says this mountain, I wonder if she gestured because Mount Gerizim is within sight distance of this well that they are at in Sychar. Any of you remember, what does Jesus tell her? What's the answer to this debate about where to worship God?
It's not the place, but they worship in spirit and in truth.
The time's coming where it's not going to matter if you worship on Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem. He also says, we Jews worship what we know. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. So he answers it by saying, actually in this debate, the Jews are right with knowing what the true word of God is. But at the same time, this whole discussion is moot because you're arguing about something that is not the most important thing. And the time's coming when the people who truly worship God are not going to localize their worship on only one of two spots. Wikipedia has all kinds of great stuff. Here's a picture, April 18th, 2006. Location is on Mount Gerizim in the West Bank in Israel. And there are the Samaritans celebrating Passover on Mount Gerizim today. They still would have a high priest. He's carrying a scroll. I'm pretty sure that would be the books of Moses, edited to say you have to worship on Mount Gerizim. But the Samaritan people, they have existed for already a couple hundred years before we meet them in Ezra. That history is going to impact the New Testament and even still is alive today. Ginny?
Do the Samaritans live as a group over there in that part of the world, or do they come all from all over the world to meet for things like that?
Everything I know about that I learned from Wikipedia, which is dangerous. So you'd have to read Wikipedia for yourself, and is that always true? I don't know. What it said is that they are localized in a couple, they're like two main communities. And it is very insular that you have to marry within the community. They have to be very careful with DNA testing before they get married to try to make sure they're not married too close, because it's such a small community, but they keep marrying within those families and communities and trying to preserve their heritage as Samaritans. The numbers on there said that 100 years ago they were down to like 150 people, and the numbers have been coming up now lately. But even like politically now, that's a tough spot to be, because they don't identify with being Jewish. They're also not Palestinian. So how do you have a group like this fit in a really volatile area? But still for them, Mount Gerizim and holding on to the books of Moses is a big thing. Other connections, like you read the book of Acts, and who's the first group of people that the apostles take the gospel to after the Jews? It's the Samaritans. And for them, they already were expecting the Messiah. So the woman at the well, she also talks to Jesus about this hope that the Messiah is coming. And so this is where God's going to judge the world and work it all out. I don't know how many people will find that even in this, before the time of Christ, that they're going to be in heaven with us because they did have a hope in a Messiah who would take away the sins of the world. And that God allowed some of these people to come to faith through that word, in spite of their ancestors worshiping false gods, and in spite of them saying, we're going to make a rule about Gerizim being the only place to worship. I don't know. Sally?
My question was about that. So Messiah is not, where's the Messiah mentioned in the 5 books of Moses? Is it just a promise that there will be a Savior? I don't mean just, but I don't remember it.
So, like in Moses and Deuteronomy, the promise is there is a prophet coming. Will be like Moses from among your own brothers. You must listen to him.
Okay. So that's where the Samaritans get the idea of Messiah.
So the idea of a Messiah coming was also shared by the Samaritans, as far as I know. And if you go back and read John chapter 4,
Right, she mentions it.
she mentions this. I know that the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. Ready to go back to Ezra? Ezra chapter 4. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were rebuilding a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." So just stopping there, what do they come and ask?
They can come and help them.
We want to help you. And connected to that is
You've been sacrificing to your God.
we have been worshiping the same God as you, and so we also want to worship with you at this temple. Now, already in the first line, it tells you these are not the friends. These are enemies, and whether they already knew that, how much of this was a good faith, true, we just want to help you and worship with you, how much of this has ulterior motives. Either case, this is the way that the Jews felt they needed to respond. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. Response is, no, we are not going to let you help us. What's the reason that's given? Because Cyrus gave it to us as our responsibility. The commentary I've been reading says it's interesting that they didn't get into a theological debate about this, although that must have been part of what was behind it too. Was it true when they said, we've been worshiping the same God as you since the time of Ezra? Kind of? Explain that, Terry. How is that kind of true and kind of not true?
Because they were worshiping their own gods and saying that they were worshiping the true God.
So they could claim we've been worshiping the Lord ever since the time of the Assyrians a long time ago. The Jews would respond, yeah, but you're also burning your kids to your Babylonian deities at the same time, and that does not go together. So were you worshiping the same God as us back then? We'd say no. Now, why not get into a theological debate about that? Commentary I read said that that's the kind of thing the Persian government would not have understood. So if they would have said, yes, you could help us, what kind of messes might that have created in the future once the temple was built?
We can tell you what to do.
Whose temple is it then? It is
Ours, not us.
it's a shared thing. This is the Samaritans and the Jews' temple, and since we helped you build it, then we should be able to worship at it. Makes sense that that'd be fair, right? And as far as what does it mean to worship the Lord, we don't know for sure what was going on in Samaria at the time of the return. The commentary says that one way you can kind of reflect that is by looking at people's names. Israelites almost always built the name of the Lord into their names. So Isaiah, anything with I-A-H at the end, means Yahweh saves. Daniel, God judges. And the Israelites weren't the only ones who would build the name of God into the names they used for their kids. If you look at the names of the Samaritans at the time of the return from exile, you see that some of them are named after the Lord, some of them are still named after other gods that had been brought in. So it may have been that they still are in this period of mixed worship. How much are they worshiping the Lord? How much other gods? Maybe there were some of them, it was mostly the Lord or all the Lord, but it could very, very well have been there still was that mixed religion that Kings talks about, because the book of Kings was probably written less than 100 years before this is happening, and probably much less than that. So Kings says, up until now, they still are mixing their worship together, and so it very likely could have still been the case that as they come and say, let's help you, we've worshiped the same God as you since way back when, that is still this syncretism that's mixing the Lord with other things. And if they would have built the temple together, then they could have told the Persians, hey, this is our temple too. And the Jews would not have been able to say, no, we're going to set the tone for this temple, and we're only going to worship the Lord here. So I don't know if this is always used as an example, but when you talk about what does church fellowship look like even for Christians today, when is it you say we're going to work together with somebody else? When do you say, we've got to say, no, you can't help us with this? Here would be a situation where maybe there were some Samaritans who did have a trust in the Lord, but because the Samaritans were not worshiping purely, the Israelites had to say, no, we're not going to have you help us build the temple. Keep going. Verse 4. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and to make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So, because they got offended by being told no, what'd they do?
Try to stop the building.
And not just stop the building.
They frustrated them
Frustrate them, other words that are used.
against.
We are going to try to make you afraid. We are going to try to make you discouraged. In the end, it was not just about the building, it was about two whole peoples and being against each other and not getting along. What's their main tactic going to be?
They basically got them to pull their building permit.
The Persians pull the verdict, just in general, they go the political route. So the Persians aren't going to stand for them fighting each other armies. That doesn't help the Persian Empire. So rather than directly attacking them, they're going to be working through official government channels to try to shut the project down. Even beginning of verse 5, knowing the right person to pay off. If this person's on our side, then we can, like you said, pull their building permit. And this goes from the time of Cyrus, king of Persia, down until the time of Darius, king of Persia. If you still have that timeline page, I guess I could circle the top one too. Nope, not that. Cyrus is up here at the top. He's in the 530s. Cambyses was after him for a few years. Darius is going to be starting about 520. He ruled a long time. So the beginning of his reign. So it's going to be over a decade that they're going to be able to use the political process to shut down the building of the temple. Keep going. Ezra now gives some actual, primary document source material from this Old Testament time. So he's going to now quote from some letters and correspondence that are part of this political process going on. And that's what we have in chapters 4, 5, and 6. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodge an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language. Raham, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Now, maybe that sounds like just boring government legalese, but here you need to slow down and look at this, because this raises some questions about how this is all fitting together and what's going on. Any of you noticing things we have to talk about?
Times don't match up.
Times. So on the timeline, who are we now writing a letter to? Xerxes and Artaxerxes. When do they live? They're living long after the temple's been completed. They're not part of this time in between Cyrus and Darius. Some people have said, well, maybe they were alternate names for people who lived back then. But the best explanation said, no, we are jumping ahead in time Artaxerxes is the king when Ezra and Nehemiah are living almost 100 years later. So one thing here is now we are jumping ahead in time significantly till after the temple's been completed. Other things people notice is this first letter that's quoted, it's got a double introduction. Who wrote the letter?
Commanding officer and secretary.
Who? What are their names?
Rehum and Shishai.
Verse 8, Rahum and Shimshai are writing a letter. What does verse 7 say? You've got a different list of men who wrote a letter to Artaxerxes in verse 7. So how does that fit in with this letter that's coming up next? Other thing that is just significant here, what language are they writing in? Aramaic, which is different from Hebrew. So if you learn as a kid the Old Testament's in Hebrew and the New Testament's in Greek, that's the simple answer to give. The fuller answer is there are 3 chapters in Ezra and also some things in Daniel that are in Aramaic. So that introduces in verse 7. Starting in verse 8 now, it's Aramaic through much of chapter 6. Not going back and forth between Hebrew and Aramaic, it's just straight Aramaic for about 2 full chapters. So in your mind, you kind of processing that? Have any reasons in mind for how this could work this way? This is where, for me, it's good to have a commentary walking me through this. Andrew Steinman, in his commentary, says, it makes sense that we are jumping ahead to the time of Artaxerxes, and that actually the men in verse 7, they were tasked with writing a longer report about this whole issue of the Jews and Samaritans not getting along and what's going on with rebuilding Jerusalem. So that they are the ones writing not just what comes up next, but this entire 2-chapter section in Aramaic. That this is part of a longer report, where they then went and found letters like the one that Rahum and Shimshai wrote. Are you following me on that? So that what is included in Ezra here is a document from Ezra's time that's now going to give the whole back history looking back to the time when the temple was rebuilt. And rather than starting with the first letter that was written, they start with the most recent letter to give the historical context, and then they're going to work backwards. So as they talk about this political process that was against the rebuilding of the temple, they actually quote from a letter that's from the time of Artaxerxes later on. Keep that in mind. Let me read the letter, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end of the letter. Rahum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rahum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Azurbanipal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. This is a copy of the letter they sent him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if the city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records you will find that the city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. That is why the city was destroyed. We inform the king that if the city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. The king sent this reply. I guess let's stop there. What would you pick out as the main things they write in this letter to Artaxerxes?
They're not gonna get money if it's rebuilt?
It has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with local politics. This is entirely, we're concerned about the tax revenues of the Persian Empire. Isn't that a great way to write? If you don't do what we're asking, the whole empire is going to fall apart and you're going to lose all kind of money. It's going to be really bad for you, is the warning they're giving the Persian king. Keep going. What is it they're writing against?
Rebuilding of the city and the walls.
The walls, which is going to be the main issue from the time of Nehemiah, which is why this letter does fit from the time of Nehemiah later on. So the point of this letter is not specifically the temple, it's to try to prevent the Israelites from rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. If you look at who's writing the letter, who do they say was resettled in this area? They lean on the fact that we're all like you. We're basically Persians and Babylonians, and so you can trust us that we know what's going on over here. Azurbanipal brought people from Persian Babylon and settled us here, and so we know what's in the royal interest better than these rebel people to the south of us who aren't really from Persia at all to begin with. And they say, check in the archives, and you'll see that these people in Judea have always been rebelling. That's why the city was destroyed, and this is why you should prevent it from being rebuilt. Do they mention anything about Jews and Samaritans are not getting along with how best to worship the Lord? Nothing like that. So it is entirely going through this political process to try to prevent Jerusalem from being rebuilt. The king sent this reply. So again, this is not the king at the time when the temple's being under construction. This is Artaxerxes writing later at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. To Rahum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that the city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? What's Artaxerxes' response? Thank you for looking out for me. You're right. These are some people we shouldn't let them rebuild because they're going to hurt our royal interests as Persians. So what does he give the Samaritans the authority to do? Order them to stop and not to rebuild, and to personally be careful not to neglect this. Don't let this threat grow. What do you think the Samaritans do after getting this letter back? As soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rahum and Shimshai, the secretary and the associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. And the way that verse is written, it wasn't just them saying, you can't build. What did they actually use? They used military force against them to force them to stop. And what do they have as proof that they can do this? They've got a letter in their pockets from King Artaxerxes. So again, this commentary I'm reading says, even though in our minds we're expecting something that'd be about the temple time, the first thing that they're quoting in the next chapter is actually from the time of rebuilding the walls, but it's an example of the same kind of political process where we're not at all talking the theology, it's only politically trying to convince the Persians that the Jews should not be undertaking building projects in Jerusalem. And here's the thing that was kind of new for me. So this is a letter that then would be from the time of Nehemiah. Nehemiah serves as the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes. And when we get to Nehemiah, you're going to find out that Nehemiah all of a sudden gets it on his heart that he needs to go back personally and help out in Jerusalem. And what is it that so put Nehemiah on fire? Can you kind of guess reading between the lines?
Had to fix this.
He is part of the inner circle of the king over in the capital city, and he's aware of this kind of correspondence going back and forth, that in his mind, this is just complete lies. And the fact that Samaritans would actually be taking military force to stop the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem is something that now is going to be this burning issue on Nehemiah's heart. So when you get to the book of Nehemiah, we'll probably come back and talk about this again. When Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem, any of you know the story already? What does he do in the middle of the night? He personally, without letting anyone else know, he personally inspects the damage to the walls in Jerusalem. And the thing that I never really got as myself is, why is he doing this at night, sneaking around, if the Babylonians destroyed the walls 100 years before? Like, who's going to get mad at him for checking out the damage the Babylonians caused? The commentary I'm reading says, actually the damage that Nehemiah was inspecting was damage caused by, you connecting the dots? The Samaritans. That when the Samaritans got this letter back, they physically burned down the gates that the Israelites had started rebuilding and damaged the walls that had been started. And so this letter from Ezra chapter 4 is pulling from the later time with the rebuilding of the wall, but it fits with the theme of how the Samaritans used the political process to block the temple being rebuilt. So verse 24 now brings us back in time. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So back on your timeline, when does Darius live? He's the one second after Cyrus. The second year of his reign would be about the year 520. So then what this commentary I've been reading by Andrew Steinman argues is that if you go back to verses 7 and 8, Rahum and Shimshai are Samaritans who are writing against the Jews in Jerusalem. They're the ones who get the letter back and then use force to stop the rebuilding. The men in verse 7 have Persian names. He argues those are people actually working with Nehemiah, and that Nehemiah had people working for him to try to defend the Jews and to write a report in favor of them. So even though this first letter is against them, the report overall, you're going to see, is a reason for King Artaxerxes to support the Jews and not be against them. And when you get to Nehemiah's time, you're going to see that he's really nervous as he presents this to the king, but he goes to King Artaxerxes himself and asks for permission to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, which if you know the backstory, the king has already written a letter saying, I don't want the walls to be rebuilt. This is against the Persian interest. So it could be that what we're reading here is part of the report Nehemiah brought with him to King Artaxerxes to get permission to go back and rebuild the walls. And that the report Nehemiah wrote, he had guys like Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabael and others digging in the Persian archives to get a second report. The initial report was, yeah, these Jews are just rebellious and we should stop them. But when you keep reading in Ezra, this report is going to say, actually, Cyrus gave the Jews permission to rebuild the temple, and we should support them in rebuilding Jerusalem. You following me on all that? The simpler point is just that as the Jews are rebuilding Jerusalem, they're facing a lot of opposition from the Samaritans and others. And so even though they had started rebuilding the temple, they rebuilt the altar. Last chapter 3, just the joy that filled them. We're back and we're sacrificing it, we're worshiping God together. All of a sudden that is going to come to a halt for at least 10 years. If you look at just the first verse of chapter 5, now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who is over them. So the thing that's going to break the people out of this funk now is God is going to send 2 prophets to them who are going to preach and urge them to get back to work building the temple, to not be afraid, to know that God is with them. And so this is why let's next week take a break. And before we read chapter 5, he mentions Haggai and Zechariah, but next week let's actually read the prophet Haggai, and then come back. Chapters 5 and 6, they are going to rebuild the temple in spite of the opposition from the Samaritans. Anything else you want to ask this morning before we wrap up with a prayer? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, you're the one ruling and directing everything. You rule your church. You're the one at work in governments around the world. And I pray today that you'd let your purpose always work out. We see that back at the time of the rebuilding of the temple and Ezra and Nehemiah. I pray that you'd be working in our land too. Take care of our country. Take care of us and our church. Let everything work together according to your will. Amen.